My daughter-in-law placed her hand directly over my phone screen while I was still holding it. She looked straight into my eyes. And then she spoke to the man on the other end of the line, my attorney, Tom Vickers, a man who had handled my family's legal affairs for 19 years, she said, in a voice that was warm and unhurried. "I'm so sorry, Uncle Tom. Dad really can't take calls right now. Since Mom passed, he gets confused easily. You know how it is." Tom said he completely understood and would call back another time. The call ended. She was standing in my kitchen, at my 70th birthday party, in front of 30 guests. I looked at her. I said nothing. Then I turned to my son Daniel, who had been standing 4 steps away and had heard every single word. Daniel met my eyes and said, without hesitation, without flinching, "Dad, she's just looking out for you. You're not as sharp as you used to be. You know that." They had forgotten something. I'm Robert Callahan. 28 years on the Pittsburgh Homicide Unit. I retired as a detective. I have spent the better part of my professional life putting people who believed they were smarter than the evidence into a courtroom and then into a cell. What Daniel and Melissa did not know, what they had never thought to ask, was that in the 6 weeks since Eleanor passed, I had not been sitting in my house grieving quietly and losing my mind. I had been building a case. I walked to my study. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk. I picked up the folder that contained 6 weeks of documentation. Unusual withdrawals from the family fund, insurance contracts bearing signatures that were not mine, and footage recovered from a dashboard camera that Melissa believed she had permanently deleted. I walked back to the dining room. I set the folder on the table. 30 guests watched as I slid the first page across the wood toward Melissa and said, quietly, and without anger, "Game's over, Melissa. Now, we talk about the law. I need to start at the beginning." And the beginning is not the birthday party. The beginning is a Thursday morning in September of 1957, in a 2-bedroom house on Mifflin Avenue in Pittsburgh's South Side, when Francis and Margaret Callahan brought their second child home from the hospital and named him Robert Francis Callahan. That was me. My father drove a bus for the Port Authority of Allegheny County for 31 years. He woke up at 4:30 every morning, drove his route, came home, ate dinner with us, and helped the neighbors with whatever needed doing on weekends. He was not a complicated man. He had one principle that I heard so often as a child that it became the operating system of my adult life. "Bobby, the only thing that matters at the end of a day is whether you did what you said you'd do." I joined the Pittsburgh Bureau of Police in 1979 at 22. Patrol first. Detective grade in 1987. Transfer to homicide in 1991. 28 years in homicide. I want to be specific about what that means, because it is the foundation of everything else in this story. Homicide investigation is not about violence. Violence is only the event that creates the investigation. Homicide work is about pattern. It is about the gap between the story a person tells and the story the evidence tells. In every case I ever worked, the person responsible for the crime had a narrative prepared. They had arranged things. They had a sequence of events they wanted you to see, and a different sequence they needed you to miss. A homicide detective's entire working life is devoted to reading the gap between those two sequences. You develop a patience for it. You learn that the person most eager to help you is frequently the person most invested in controlling what you find. You learn that panic, when it comes late after the person believes they have succeeded, not before. You learn that evidence does not disappear simply because someone believes they have removed it. After 28 years, you do not turn these skills off when you go home. They become the way you see. My late wife Eleanor used to tell me I was incapable of sitting in a restaurant without tracking the behavioral patterns of the other tables. I would tell her I wasn't doing that. She would tell me I had been watching the man by the window for 12 minutes. She was always right. I retired in 2019 with a pension, a commendation from the chief of police that I keep in a desk drawer rather than on a wall, and the brown spiral notebook I have carried in my shirt pocket since 1991. Old habit. When something matters, you write it down. Date, time, what was said, who was present. I still carry the notebook. My house is a 3-bedroom colonial on Westmore Avenue in Mount Lebanon, a Pittsburgh suburb where Eleanor and I had lived since 1983. We raised our son Daniel in that house. We buried Eleanor's mother from that house, and we celebrated Daniel's wedding reception in the backyard. 39 years of ordinary, irreplaceable life. The other property is a cabin on Canute Lake, approximately 90 miles north of Pittsburgh. I built it myself in the summer of 1991. Daniel was 10 years old. He framed walls beside me and drove the first nail himself, which I allowed because a 10-year-old boy who has driven a nail into a structure he helped build understands something about the world that cannot be explained from the outside. The cabin is 3 rooms on 60 feet of lakeshore. It is the most satisfying thing I have ever made with my hands. Those are the assets. The Westmore house, the Canute cabin, a retirement portfolio I had managed carefully since leaving the department, and Eleanor's life insurance payout, which I had not touched and did not intend to touch. I am telling you this in detail because every piece of it matters. Every number, every property, every account. Eleanor Marie Callahan, born Donovan, passed away on a Thursday morning in the spring. She was 66 years old. The cause was a cardiac event that followed complications from a surgery she had undergone 6 weeks earlier. She had known about the risk going in. She had told me about the risk the evening before her procedure. In the matter-of-fact way Eleanor had always approached serious things, and she had asked me not to look like I was calculating probabilities. I told her I wasn't. She told me she could see me doing it. She was right. We had been married for 43 years. Eleanor was not a woman who needed a paragraph of description. She was the person who made every room she entered feel like the version of that room you remembered most clearly. After she passed, the house on Westmore was the same house. Same walls. Same morning light through the kitchen window. Same blue apron with small yellow flowers on the hook by the back door. I left the apron there. I have left it there every day since. Some people would tell me to take it down. Those people can manage their own grief. Daniel was at the hospital the morning Eleanor passed. He sat with me in the waiting area. He cried, which I had not expected because Daniel had spent most of his adult life performing a version of composure that I recognized as borrowed from me, but had never quite fit him. I appreciated that he cried. It meant the feeling was still direct, not managed. His wife Melissa arrived 2 hours later. She had driven from their home in the North Hills, which takes about 40 minutes in morning traffic. She had stopped for coffee. I noticed the cup in her hand when she walked in. I noted this and did not say anything about it. People handle shock differently. Maybe she needed the coffee. I filed it and moved on. In the first weeks after Eleanor passed, Daniel and Melissa were present and useful. They brought food. They helped me sort through Eleanor's clothing and her personal items when I asked them to. They came on weekends and stayed for dinner. Melissa was kind in the practical ways that matter. When someone has recently lost their partner, she washed the dishes without being asked. She handled phone calls. I didn't have the capacity for. She organized the thank you cards I owed to people who had sent flowers. I was grateful. I want to say that clearly. In those first weeks, I was genuinely grateful, and I received their attention in the spirit I believed it was being offered. I was wrong about the spirit. It started in month 2. Daniel began calling more often, but the calls had a direction to them that the earlier calls hadn't had. Had I updated the will recently? Had I spoken to a financial advisor about restructuring the portfolio now that Eleanor was gone? Had I thought about whether the Westmore house made sense for one person? Had I considered consolidating accounts? Each question was reasonable, in isolation. People ask those questions of widowed parents. It is appropriate to think about estate planning after a spouse passes. What made me reach for the notebook was the direction. Every question pointed the same way, that Bob's affairs were probably not in order, and that Bob needed help. I wrote down the date and the substance of the call. The following week, Melissa called my financial advisor's office. Not to speak with him directly, to speak with his assistant. She introduced herself as Daniel's wife and mentioned that she was helping coordinate things for the family following Eleanor's death. She asked whether I had come in recently and whether the beneficiary designations on my accounts had been reviewed. My financial advisor, Carl Brewer, called me the same afternoon to let me know about the contact. Carl is the kind of man who does not allow a third party to inquire about a client's account without notifying that client. He has been managing my retirement portfolio for 14 years, and he knew Eleanor by name. I thanked him. I asked him to document the inquiry. He said he already had. I opened the brown notebook. Month 3. I heard the phrase for the first time. I was at a retirement gathering for a former neighbor named Frank Ostrowski, a high school principal who had lived 3 houses down for 20 years. Frank said something that I have thought about nearly every day since. He said my son had called him the previous week. He said Daniel wanted Frank to know that Bob had been having some rough patches since Eleanor's death. That Bob sometimes forgot conversations. That Bob had been found leaving the stove on. That Bob had started leaving the front door unlocked at night. Frank asked me, gently, and with genuine concern, whether any of this was true. I told him none of it was. He said he thought Daniel was probably just worried. I said probably. I drove home. I sat at the kitchen table. I looked at Eleanor's apron on the hook. Then I opened the notebook and I wrote down everything Frank had told me, including the specific details Daniel had provided. The stove, the front door, the forgotten conversations. I noted that none of these incidents had occurred. I noted the date and Frank's full name. I had 28 years of practice at recognizing what the construction of a false record looked like in its early stages. What Frank had described was groundwork. Someone was creating witnesses. Someone was establishing a narrative before the narrative was needed. My son was building a case against his own father. And the question that kept me awake that night was not about Daniel. It was about Melissa. Because Daniel is my son, and I know Daniel, and Daniel does not plan 6 weeks ahead for anything. Daniel has never been a strategic thinker. He is a good man in many ways, and a reactive one. He responds to whatever is in front of him with the energy of the current moment. Melissa plans. I had watched her plan for 9 years. Wedding seating arrangements, holiday schedules, social dynamics within their friend group, Daniel's career decisions, which vacations they took, and when and where. Melissa operated from a map that she had drawn months or years in advance. It was not a criticism. It was an observation, and what I understood. Sitting at my kitchen table on a Thursday evening with a cup of cold coffee and Eleanor's apron in my sightline, was that Melissa had been drawing a map. I needed to find out where it led. Here is what I found when I started looking. I want to be precise, because precision is how you build a case that holds. The family fund was a joint account. Eleanor and I had maintained for 30 years to cover family expenses, holidays, emergencies, the grandchildren's birthday gifts, any significant family cost that didn't belong in our personal accounts. The balance when Eleanor passed was $14,230, 6 weeks after Eleanor's death. When I pulled the statement, the balance was $6,840. $7,390 had left the account in 6 weeks in 17 separate transactions, none of which I had authorized. The transactions were described as household administration, estate coordination fees, and family trust management. None of those descriptions corresponded to anything I had approved or arranged. I called Carl Brewer. Carl pulled the transaction authorization records. Every withdrawal had been initiated through an online access credential that had been set up 18 months earlier. The credential had been added during a period when Eleanor had been briefly hospitalized for a procedure and I had, at Melissa's suggestion, allowed her to handle some routine bill payments. The credential had never been removed from the account. I sat with that for a long time. 18 months earlier, Eleanor was in the hospital. Melissa had offered to help. The credential was added. And for 18 months, until Eleanor's death, it had apparently been dormant. Then, in the 6 weeks following Eleanor's passing, it had been used 17 times. She had been waiting. That was the first thing I found. The second was worse. Eleanor had held 2 life insurance policies. One was a policy we had taken together in 2001, naming each other as primary beneficiary with Daniel as the secondary. The second was a smaller policy Eleanor had maintained independently since before we were married, originally naming her parents as beneficiaries and updated over the years. I reviewed both policies as part of the estate process. The first policy was exactly as it should have been. I was the primary beneficiary. The paperwork was clean. The second policy had been modified. The beneficiary designation had been changed 14 months before Eleanor's death. The change was documented in a form dated in March, bearing Eleanor's signature. The new primary beneficiary was listed as the Callahan Family Estate Trust, an entity I had no knowledge of and had never established. I called the insurance company and asked to speak with their policy administration department. I asked about the modification. They confirmed it was on file. I asked for a copy of the authorization form to be sent to me. When I received it, I did 2 things. First, I looked at the signature. I looked at it for a long time. I had lived with Eleanor's handwriting for 43 years. I knew the way she formed every letter, the slight leftward lean of her capital E, the way her letters closed at the top. The signature on the modification form was close. It was practiced. It would pass a casual review, but it was not Eleanor's handwriting. Second, I called Tom Vickers. Tom Vickers is 61 years old and has practiced law in Pittsburgh for 35 years, primarily in estate planning and elder financial law. He handled my father's estate in 2007. He knows my family the way attorneys know families when they've seen them in their most complicated moments. I met him at his office on a Tuesday morning with the bank records, the insurance modification form, and the brown notebook. He read everything. He looked at the signature on the insurance form for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "Bob, I need to be very careful about what I say here." I said, "Say it anyway." He said, "If this signature is not Eleanor's, and I agree with your assessment that it is not, then what we are looking at is potentially document fraud in connection with an insurance beneficiary modification. Combined with the unauthorized fund transactions, you may be looking at criminal conduct." I said, "What else do I need?" He said, "Pattern evidence, a clear documented record of the purpose behind all of this. The fund withdrawals and the insurance modification are concerning, but a defense attorney will argue alternative explanations for both. You need something that establishes intent." I said, "I'm working on that. I want to tell you about the dashcam footage." Melissa drives a gray sedan. It is a relatively new car, leased, with a factory-installed front-facing dashboard camera that records automatically when the vehicle is in motion. The footage is stored on a small memory card inside the camera unit and syncs to a cloud account that the manufacturer provides. The cloud sync can be disabled manually. Melissa had disabled it. She had also, as I discovered when I examined the camera during a visit to their home approximately 5 weeks after Eleanor's passing, I had gone to return a casserole dish. And Melissa was at work, and Daniel let me in, and then went to take a call in another room. She had removed the memory card from the camera unit. She had not removed it from the house. I am not going to explain in detail how I know where she kept it. I will tell you that I found it. I will tell you that I had the technical means to access it. I will tell you that I spent an evening reviewing the footage it contained with a portable card reader that I had owned since my investigative years, When dashcam evidence had begun appearing in cases with enough frequency that I had learned the hardware, the footage covered approximately 14 months. Most of it was unremarkable, except for 2 recordings. The first was a recording from a day in January, 4 months before Eleanor's passing, in which Melissa's vehicle was parked in the lot of a professional office building on 5th Avenue in Pittsburgh. The camera's angle showed the building's entrance and signage. The signage was for a law firm specializing in estate planning, elder law, and guardianship proceedings. Melissa entered the building at 11:12 in the morning. She exited at 12:31. I cross-referenced the date with what I knew of Eleanor's medical calendar. Eleanor had been at a chemotherapy appointment across town from 11 to 1:30 that day. Daniel had driven her. While Eleanor was receiving chemotherapy, Melissa was at a guardianship attorney's office. The second recording was from 6 weeks after Eleanor's death. Melissa's vehicle was parked near a coffee shop in the North Hills. The recording showed her meeting a man I did not immediately recognize. They sat at an outdoor table for 40 minutes. He had a briefcase. She had a folder. She passed him several documents. He reviewed them, made marks, returned them. I ran the man's vehicle plate through a contact I maintained from my department years. He was a process server, a man whose professional function is to deliver legal documents. What legal documents, I did not yet know. But the sequence, the guardianship attorney in January, the forged signature, the fund withdrawals, and now a process server, receiving documents from Melissa, was a sequence I had seen before in different contexts. Someone was preparing to file paperwork to have me declared legally incapacitated. I had 4 weeks before my birthday party. Mini hook. I now had the fund records, the insurance forgery, the dashcam footage, and a process server in the sequence. What I did not yet have was the document that tied all of it to a single stated purpose. I needed the filing they were preparing, and it came to me in a way I did not anticipate. On a Monday morning, 14 days before the birthday party, my mail carrier delivered a certified letter. The return address was a law firm I did not recognize, with a Pittsburgh address. Inside was a document titled Notice of Intent to Petition for Guardianship of the Person and Estate of Robert Francis Callahan. My son and his wife had filed the paperwork. The petition alleged cognitive decline. It alleged impaired judgment. It cited 3 specific incidents: leaving the stove unattended on March 4th, failing to lock the front door on multiple occasions in February and March, and making confused or contradictory statements to family members on at least 4 occasions since Eleanor's death. None of these incidents had occurred. Every single alleged incident was fabricated. The petition named Daniel Callahan as proposed guardian of my person. It named Melissa Callahan as proposed guardian of my estate. If granted, Daniel would control my medical and personal decisions. Melissa would control every financial asset I owned. The Callahan Family Estate Trust, which Melissa had established as beneficiary on Eleanor's insurance policy, would, under the terms described in the petition's supporting documents, become the operative financial vehicle once guardianship was established. The trustee of that entity, as set forth in incorporation documents Tom later obtained, was Melissa Callahan. There it was. The map. Eleanor's insurance money, plus the Westmore house, plus the retirement portfolio, plus the Canute cabin, all of it, flowing into an entity controlled by Melissa, while I sat in whatever arrangement they decided was appropriate for a man who could not manage his own affairs. I called Tom Vickers. I told him the petition had arrived. He said, "I've been expecting this. How do you want to proceed?" I said, "We proceed the same way I always proceeded. Build the counter case first, then respond." Tom said, "The birthday party is in 2 weeks." I said, "I know." He said, "Is that when you intend to respond?" I said, "I'll respond when the moment is right and not before." There was a pause. Tom said, "Bob, are you sure about this?" I said, "I've been building cases for 28 years, Tom. I know how to time a close. The folder had 6 sections when I was done with it. Section 1. A complete cognitive evaluation conducted by Dr. Patricia Hendricks, my internist of 17 years, on a date 11 days before the birthday party. Full assessment battery, every component. Results documented in writing, signed, and notarized. Scoring 92nd percentile for my age group on every measure. Section 2. The Brown Notebook, transcribed. 38 individual entries covering 44 days of observed and documented incidents. Every call Daniel made to neighbors and friends that I had been able to verify through direct conversation. Every unauthorized fund transaction, with date, amount, and the account credential used. Every contact Melissa had made with my professional advisors, without my knowledge or consent. Section 3. The bank records. 17 transactions. $7,390. Itemized with descriptions and the credential trail Carl Brewer had documented. Section 4. The insurance modification form. A copy of Eleanor's actual signature taken from a document she had signed in my presence 14 months before she passed. Placed next to the modification form's signature for direct comparison. And a letter from a forensic document examiner named Ruth Pellegrino, who had worked with the Pittsburgh Bureau of Police for 11 years and whom I had called as a professional contact. Ruth had reviewed both signatures and provided a written opinion that the modification form's signature was not consistent with Eleanor's authentic signature pattern. Forgery. In writing. Signed by an expert. Section 5. The dashcam footage. Printed frame captures from both recordings. A summary of dates, locations, and the plate search result for the process server's vehicle. The timeline connecting the guardianship attorney visit in January to the petition filed 14 days before my birthday. Section 6. The legal counterfilings Tom had prepared. An answer to the guardianship petition, including my cognitive evaluation as Exhibit A, and the forensic document examination as Exhibit B. A motion to dismiss the petition on the grounds that the supporting allegations were fabricated, with the neighbor statements Tom had taken from Frank Ostrowski and 2 others as supporting declarations. A referral letter to the Allegheny County District Attorney's Office documenting the alleged forgery and the unauthorized fund transactions, and requesting a review for criminal charges. Tom had filed the criminal referral on the Tuesday before the party. I had been in his office when he sent it. The folder was organized, tabbed, and complete. On the evening of November 14th, I put it in the bottom drawer of my study desk, put on Eleanor's choice of charcoal suit, and went out to greet my guests. Minnie Hook. For 3 hours, I ate dinner and accepted birthday wishes at a party my son and daughter-in-law had organized. I listened to speeches. I thanked people. The folder sat in my desk drawer. Then Melissa answered my phone. I need to tell you what the party looked like before I tell you what happened at 8:15. Daniel and Melissa had organized it well. I will give them that. The catering was good. The house was clean and well arranged, which required effort since the Westmore house has a lot of rooms and I don't maintain them all at the same standard. 30 guests, as I have said. People I had known for decades, along with several of their own friends and acquaintances who had been introduced into my social circle over the years through them. I noticed the arrangement of the guest list. Frank Ostrowski was there, my neighbor, Paul Gershow, and his wife Linda, 2 women from Eleanor's church group who had been recipients of Daniel's calls about my supposed confusion. These were people who had been primed with a particular version of Bob Callahan over the previous months. They had been placed at a party to serve, consciously or not, as a soft audience for whatever Melissa and Daniel intended to execute that evening. I also noticed who was absent. My partner of 11 years at Homicide, Ray Kowalski, who remained my closest friend and who would have seen through everything happening in that room within 20 minutes of arrival, was not on the guest list. My sister Carol and her husband were not on it. Father Brennan, from Street Bernard's, who had known me for 30 years, was not on it. The list had been curated. I had made my own calls. Ray was parked 2 blocks from the house. He had agreed to be available and to come if I called. I had not told him exactly what was happening. I had told him I was building something and might need a witness. He had said, without asking for more information, "I'll be close. 28 years of partnership." He understood the language. The party moved through dinner without incident. The food was good. The conversation was what it is when 30 people who don't all know each other find the surface topics that carry an evening. Toasts were made. Daniel gave a speech that I listened to with the specific attention I give to statements made by parties in an investigation, noting what was said, noting what was emphasized, noting what was absent. The speech was warm in its language. It used the word family 9 times. It mentioned Eleanor 4 times. It mentioned my age and the milestone of 70 twice in a way that subtly framed the evening around the concept of transition. Melissa circulated and was charming, which she always is. I have watched Melissa in social settings for 9 years, and she is genuinely skilled. She makes people feel specifically seen. She asks questions that demonstrate memory and attention. She is the kind of person who remembers what someone told her about their grandchildren 8 months ago and asks a follow-up question at the right moment. She was working the room. I recognized it for what it was. At 8:12, my phone rang. Tom Vickers. Calling to confirm a detail about the document, filing the kind of routine professional follow-up that attorneys handle on evenings before a deadline, because deadlines do not observe the social calendar. I answered in the kitchen, slightly apart from the main group. I turned slightly toward the window to reduce the ambient noise. I heard Melissa's footsteps before I saw her. She appeared in 11 seconds. I counted. She moved to my left side and placed her hand flat over the face of my phone. Not covering the microphone, covering the screen. The physical gesture of someone taking control of an object. She looked directly at me and spoke to Tom clearly and without rushing. "I'm so sorry, Uncle Tom. Dad really can't take calls right now. Since Mom passed, he gets confused easily. You know how it is with these things." Tom said he completely understood. He said he would call back another time. He said goodnight. The call ended. Melissa lifted her hand from the phone. She looked at me with an expression that I have seen on faces in interview rooms. The expression of someone who has just done something they have planned and who is now waiting for the response they have anticipated. I looked at her. I said nothing. I turned toward the kitchen doorway, where Daniel had appeared. He was standing with the same composed expression I recognized from the speech prepared, managed, the composure of someone who has rehearsed the scene. Daniel said, "Dad, she's just looking out for you. You're not as sharp as you used to be. You know that." In front of my guests, in my house, at my 70th birthday, I looked at my son for 3 seconds. I set the phone on the counter. I said, "I'll be right back." I walked down the hallway. I went into my study. I closed the door. The study is the room I have thought in for 39 years. The desk belonged to my father. The chair belonged to Eleanor's father. On the left side of the desk is a photograph of Eleanor and me at the Canute cabin in the summer of 2015. She is laughing. I do not remember what I said to make her laugh. I am looking at her in the photograph the way I have looked at her in memory every day since March. On the right side of the desk, nothing. That side was cleared. I opened the bottom drawer. I picked up the folder. I held it for a moment. I thought about Frank Ostrovsky telling me what my son had said about me. I thought about Carl Brewer calling me the afternoon Melissa inquired about my accounts. I thought about Eleanor's handwriting, 43 years of it, on grocery lists and birthday cards and notes left on the kitchen table in the morning, and the practiced imitation of it on an insurance form. I thought about Eleanor in the hospital, 2 hours before her procedure, asking me not to look like I was calculating probabilities. I thought about Ruth Pellegrino's written opinion on that signature. I thought about the process server sitting at an outdoor table in the North Hills, taking documents from my daughter-in-law. I opened the folder. I looked at section 1. The cognitive evaluation. 92nd percentile. I stood up. I walked back to the dining room. 30 people were still in the room. Most of them had shifted in the way that parties shift when something has happened in an adjacent space. The conversations were quieter. The attention was looser. Everyone was maintaining a posture of normalcy while tracking the doorway where I had exited. I walked to the dining table and set the folder down in the center. I stood at the head of the table. I did not raise my voice. I said, I want to address something directly, because several of the people in this room have heard things about my mental condition over the past several months that I would like to correct. The room went quiet. Melissa was standing near the kitchen doorway. She looked at the folder. Something moved across her expression, a rapid recalculation. Daniel was beside her. He was looking at me with the expression I recognized from his childhood when something had gone wrong and he was trying to understand how. I said, there is a folder on this table. It contains 6 sections. I would like Daniel and Melissa to review it before anyone else in this room forms a conclusion about what is happening here. Daniel moved toward the table. He sat down. Melissa sat beside him. I watched Daniel's hand as he opened the folder. Section 1. The cognitive evaluation. Daniel's jaw tightened. He turned to section 2. The notebook transcription. He stopped on the 3rd page. I knew what was on the 3rd page. The entry dated March 14th, documenting the call he had made to Frank Ostrovsky. The specific incidents cited the stove, the front door, the forgotten conversations listed beside the notation. None of these incidents occurred. Frank Ostrovsky, 2 seats away, was very still. Daniel turned to section 3. The bank records. The 17 transactions. His eyes moved down the column of dates and amounts. Melissa reached across and turned to section 4. The insurance form. Eleanor's authentic signature beside the modification form's version. Ruth Pellegrino's written opinion. I watched Melissa read the expert's conclusion. She set the papers down. Her hands were not shaking. I want to be precise about this, because I have been in rooms with people who have just understood that they have been caught, and they do not always behave the way people expect. Melissa's hands were still. Her face was controlled. What I saw in her expression was not guilt. It was the specific recognition of a person who has run a complex calculation and has just reached the point where the result is no longer what they projected. She turned to section 5. The dashcam images. January 14th. 5th Avenue. The law firm specializing in guardianship proceedings. Melissa entering at 11:12. Eleanor at chemotherapy, across town. Melissa looked at those images for 4 seconds. Then she looked at me. I looked back. I said, Section 5 also contains the plate trace on the process server you met in the North Hills 6 weeks after Eleanor passed, and the filing date on the guardianship petition, which was 2 weeks before this party. Daniel said, Dad, it was barely a word. It was the beginning of a sentence he did not know how to finish. I said, Section 6 is the counterfiling Tom Vickers submitted on Tuesday, including the criminal referral to the Allegheny County District Attorney for document forgery and unauthorized fund transactions. The room was absolutely still. I looked at Melissa. I said, Game's over, Melissa. Now we talk about the law. She said nothing. Daniel said nothing. For 15 seconds, no one in the room said anything. Then I called Ray Kowalski, Mini Hook. Ray was at the front door in 4 minutes. He is a retired homicide detective, which means he arrived, assessed the room in 8 seconds, and said nothing unnecessary. I handed him the folder. He reviewed the key sections while I sat at the table and waited. 30 guests watched this happen. What came next was not what Daniel and Melissa had prepared for. Ray looked up from the folder and said, To no one in particular. I've seen prosecuted cases built on less than this. He set the folder down. He looked at Daniel. He said, "Son, you need to call an attorney right now. Tonight. Not in the morning. Tonight." Daniel looked at his father. He looked at his wife. He looked at the folder on the table. He said, "Melissa." She said nothing. He said her name again. She picked up her purse. She stood up. She walked toward the front hall. Daniel sat at the table for another 30 seconds. He looked at me across the wood, and the folder, and the 30 guests, and the 43 years of dinners in this room. He said, "Dad, I need you to know I didn't." He stopped. I said, "Daniel, get a lawyer." That conversation happens with attorneys present. Not here. He stood. He walked toward the front hall. The front door opened and closed. I looked at my guests. I said, "I apologize that you were here for this. I want you to know that I am in full health. I am cognitively intact, and I am completely capable of managing my own affairs. Any information you may have received to the contrary was not accurate. I would like you to hear that from me directly." Frank Ostrovsky said, "Bobby." I said, "I know, Frank." "It's all right." He nodded. I sat down at the head of my table. I was 69 years old that evening, with a 70th birthday party emptying around me, and for the first time in 6 weeks, I felt something uncomplicate itself. The criminal referral went to the Allegheny County District Attorney's office. Tom called me 11 days after the party to tell me that the forgery matter had been accepted for review. I want to be careful about how much I say here, because some of what followed is still in a process that does not belong to me to describe publicly. What I can tell you is that the modification of an insurance beneficiary designation using a forged signature is a matter that the district attorney's office takes seriously, and that Ruth Pellegrino's forensic opinion carries significant professional weight. Melissa retained an attorney within 24 hours of the party. Daniel retained a separate attorney 4 days later, which told me something about the state of their communication. The guardianship petition was withdrawn 6 weeks after the party. The withdrawal was filed by Melissa's attorney and cited changed circumstances. Tom filed our response for the record anyway, because the response contained the documented evidence of fabrication, and he wanted it preserved in the court file. The $7,390 was returned to the family fund account. The transfer occurred through Melissa's attorney as part of a restitution arrangement whose details I have agreed to keep confidential. I will say that the amount returned was the full amount taken, plus the costs associated with documenting the unauthorized access. The insurance policy modification was reversed. The beneficiary designation was corrected to reflect what Eleanor had actually intended. I know what she had intended because we had discussed it together, in writing, in the estate planning documents we had updated 4 years before her death. The Callahan Family Estate Trust that Melissa had inserted as beneficiary does not exist in any document that I authorized. It exists only in the filing she arranged. Whether it continues to exist for other purposes is a question for the district attorney's process, not for me. Daniel called me 3 weeks after the party. He called from his office in the middle of a workday. He did not call with Melissa on the line. He did not call with his attorney on the line. He called alone, which told me more than the call itself. He said, "Dad, I need to tell you something." I said, "Go ahead." He said, "I knew about the fund withdrawals. Melissa told me she was handling estate expenses, and I didn't ask what that meant. I told myself it was fine. I know that's not an excuse." I said, "No, it isn't." He said, "I didn't know about the insurance form. I want you to know that." I said, "Daniel, I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to hear it completely before you respond." He said, "Okay." I said, "Whether you knew about the forgery specifically, you built a case against your father's mind. You called Frank Ostrowski and told him I was leaving the stove on. You called other neighbors and told them I was confused. You sat in this house for months, helping construct a portrait of a man who couldn't manage his own life. And then you stood at my birthday party and told me to my face that I wasn't sharp anymore. Silence. I said, that is what you did, not Melissa. You. He said. Yes, I said. I know who taught you to drive and who framed the walls of that cabin and who sat with you for 4 hours in a waiting room while your appendix was out and who has never, in 40 years of being your father, told you something that wasn't true. You know what kind of man I am. And you chose to do what you did anyway. He said. I know. He said. I don't know how to fix this. I said. I don't know either. That's the most honest thing I've said to you in 6 weeks. I don't know if it fixes, Daniel. Some things don't fix. Some things you carry with you, and you decide every day whether to let it define what comes next or to build something different on top of it. He was quiet. I said, the cabin is still yours someday, not Melissa's. Yours. You drove the first nail in that building when you were 10 years old, and that is a fact. Nothing changes. He said, Dad, I said, build something, Daniel. That is what I want from you. Not an apology, not an explanation. Build something you can be proud of. He said, I'll try. I said, I know you will. Mini hook. 3 months after the birthday party, something happened that I had not anticipated and that changed the texture of what came after. My granddaughter, Emma, is 12 years old. She called me on a Saturday morning in February, which was unusual because Emma typically texts rather than calls, and which told me the call was intentional rather than accidental. She said, Grandpa, is everything okay with Dad? I said, what do you mean? She said, he seems sad. And he and Mom aren't talking right. I said, they're working through something. She said, does it have to do with you? I said, some of it. She was quiet for a moment. Emma has Eleanor's quality of sitting with a question before responding to it. She said, are you okay? I said, I'm okay, Em. I'm doing all right. She said, Grandpa, can we go to the cabin this summer? I said, yes. We'll go in July. She said, can Owen come? I said, Owen always comes. She said, good. He caught a fish last time and he won't stop talking about it. I said, that's what fish are for. She laughed. She has Eleanor's laugh. I noticed this when she was 4 years old, and I notice it every time. She said, I love you, Grandpa. I said, I love you too, Em. I'll see you in July. I went to the cabin on a Thursday in late November, about 2 weeks after the party, just to check on it before winter. The drive is 90 miles, and the last 20 are on a road that follows the lakeshore. The water was the color it gets in November when the light is low and the sky is the same gray as the surface. I unlocked the cabin and walked through the 3 rooms. Everything was as I had left it in October. The window in the main room looks directly at the lake. I stood at it for a while. I thought about my father's sentence. The only thing that matters at the end of a day is whether you did what you said you'd do. I had done what I said I'd do. The evidence was documented. The filing was counterfiled. The criminal referral was in the right office. The estate was protected. The folder was in Tom Vickers' safe, and in the county court file, and in the Allegheny County District Attorney's intake system. I had done what I said I'd do. I went to the dock. The boards needed some attention. A section near the eastern edge was starting to show the wear of 33 years of winters. I made a note in the brown notebook. I would come back in April with the right materials and fix it before Emma and Owen arrived in July. Fix what can be fixed. Document what cannot. A detective's life, applied to the only things left that matter. I want to say something honest before I finish this. The night of the birthday party, after Ray Kowalski left, and the caterers left, and the last guests had gone, I sat at my kitchen table alone. Eleanor's apron was on the hook. The table was cleared. The folder was back in my study. I thought about what I had done and whether I would do it differently. I wouldn't. The documentation was correct. The filing was correct. The timing was correct. If Eleanor's insurance policy had been allowed to proceed with a forged signature, I would not have been able to challenge it without evidence. If the guardianship petition had been filed without a countercase already prepared, I would have been fighting from behind. Everything I did in those 6 weeks was the right sequence in the right order. But here's the other thing I thought about. I thought about Daniel at 10 years old, driving the first nail into the frame of the cabin wall, looking at me with the expression of a child who has just understood that he is capable of something permanent. That man is still in there somewhere. Under whatever Melissa convinced him of, under whatever combination of financial pressure and moral laziness allowed him to go along with what happened, that man is still there. I know this because I know Daniel. And because a 10-year-old's face telling you he can build something does not disappear. It gets covered. Sometimes it gets buried. But it does not disappear. Whether he chooses to uncover it is not something I can decide for him. What I can do is leave the door open and see who walks through it. The cabin is still his. I'm 67 years old. Eleanor's apron is on the hook by the back door. The cabin at Canute Lake will be there in July when Emma and Owen come. The dock will be repaired before they arrive. Owen will catch a fish and talk about it for 6 months. Emma will read on the dock and announce some new principles she has arrived at. The brown notebook is in my shirt pocket. Tom Vickers filed everything correctly. The evidence is on record. And in the fall, when the county's process reaches whatever conclusion it reaches, that too will be on record. I do not control what that process produces. I contributed what I was able to contribute, in the form that makes it useful, to the people whose function it is to handle it. That is all anyone can do. One last thing. After I called Ray that night at the birthday party, and after he arrived and reviewed the folder and said what he said, there was a moment before Daniel and Melissa left where Daniel looked at the table and did not say anything. Ray said to me quietly, so only I could hear, "You gave him the documentation and you gave him the letter?" I said, "There was no formal letter tonight." Ray said, "Then what did you give him?" I thought about it. I said, "The truth." Ray said, "That's usually enough." He was right. It usually is. If you've ever had to build a case against someone you loved, if you've ever had to hold evidence in your hand that you wished didn't exist and take the right next step anyway, drop one word in the comments that describes what that feels like. Just one word. I read every one. If this story meant something to you, subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because a detective never really retires. My name is Robert Callahan, 28 years, Pittsburgh homicide. And the most important case I ever built was the one that started the morning Eleanor passed and ended on the night of my 70th birthday. The folder is in Tom Vickers' safe. The game is over.